This book took a lot of mental energy. Hey guys, welcome back. Our Book of the Month poll winner for October was The Unmaking of June Farrow. Now, I loved this author's previous novel, Spells for Forgetting. So when I saw that this one was the poll winner, I was so excited to read it. Plus, it felt like the perfect atmospheric book for October. I mean, like, look at this cover. It's so beautiful. In this book, June Farrow is determined to end the Farrow curse that has plagued the women in her family for decades. She also wants to find out what caused her mother's disappearance. So before we get into the spoilers, a little spoiler-free review. I felt the same way about this author's writing as I did in the book Spells for Forgetting. I think this author does a wonderful job of creating this atmosphere. Her writing is detailed and emotion-provoking. I just absolutely love her as an author. So of course, I was anticipating to really enjoy this book. I did find with this book that I actually really needed to pay attention to the dates and the names in the book. Instead of it being a more passive read, I definitely needed to pay attention to fully grasp certain elements of the book. In the end, it came together perfectly though. I do feel like it's a well-crafted book. I don't feel like I can say much else about the plot because there are some secrets and twists that if I say too much, I will ruin it. So I'll just leave it at that. It's an immersive novel that I feel is worth the read. So now it's time to get into the spoilers. So if you haven't read the book and you don't want anything spoiled, this is your warning to stop. So this book starts out in the month of June in 2023. Dates in this book are very important. So the book starts with a small funeral for June Farrow's grandmother, Margaret. Gran has been June's parental figure her whole life. When June's mother was pregnant with her, she went missing. And then when June was approximately 7 months old, she was found in the town, just out in the open 7 months later, abandoned in town with her mother's necklace. So everyone knew she was the Farrow baby. However, her mother has never been found. The Farrow women in the book have what is considered a bit of a curse to them. The Farrow women always have one child, a girl, and then the Farrow women always develop a sort of condition that causes delusions and ends up driving them mad. Now, this has happened all the way back along the family line, and it develops at different times for each of the women in the family line. June's mother was reportedly having delusions that were driving her mad when she disappeared. June's gran, however, didn't start having these delusions until she was an older woman, and at the start of the book, her gran started getting sick about 3 years prior to her death. Now, June has a secret that she's been keeping from her small group of loved ones. For about a year now, she's been experiencing these episodes. So she keeps a journal of what she experiences, and they range from things like seeing a horse running away, or hearing her name being called, or smells that aren't there, and then she keeps seeing the same man over and over and over again. And I have to mention, none of those things are there for other people. They're all in her head. Wildest and most important thing she keeps seeing is a random red door that just keeps appearing out of the middle of nowhere. Now, she has started going to the doctor regarding this, and she's told to keep this record, especially since Gran's death. She's been experiencing these episodes more frequently, so she's trying to figure out what is triggering them. Since this is a known thing for the Farrow women to go through, she is highly encouraged to let the people in her life know what's going on. So for side characters in the beginning, we really only have a few that are impactful to the beginning of the story. First is Birdie, and she's Gran's lifelong friend who moved in when Gran started getting sick. And then there's also June's only and best friend, Mason. They've been friends since they were children. They're both now 34, and they're just super, super duper close. There isn't any sort of like romantic connection between the two of them. Ever since June has been aware of the Farrow woman curse, she's vowed to never find a partner, never had a kid. She wants to try to have the curse end with her, essentially. She has always promised Mason that as soon as she starts experiencing the Farrow curse, she will let him know. Well, that didn't happen. She's been keeping this secret for the last year, but about the 20% mark of the book, her secret comes out to him, and he vows to her that he's going to be her caretaker and he's going to go through her with this. Now, leading up to Mason discovering what's going on, the few days after Gran's death, June has been going through a bit of a spiral. So within the first 20% of the book, a lot of information was being set up for us, so we're just gonna backtrack a little bit. A few days after Gran's funeral, June is going through the mail and she finds a envelope addressed to her from Gran, post-dated a few days before Gran's death. Now inside this envelope is an old picture dated from 1911 of a man and a woman, and on the back it's labeled as being Nathaniel Rutherford and his wife. So Nathaniel was a minister in their small town who had been murdered in 1950, and ever since then his death has been unsolved. In this picture, he's a younger looking man, obviously, and next to him is a woman who looks identical to June's mother, Susanna. June has no idea why her Gran would send this to her. She never even knew that her family was connected in any way to the ministers. So June starts doing some digging. She compares the old photo she has to a newer photo of her mom from before she disappeared, and it's definitely the same person. And then she researches Nathaniel's murder, and then she also researches and finds a marriage license between Nathaniel and Susanna Farrow, but it's dated 1911. So it's the same name as her mom, but it clearly can't be her mom, right? Because her mom wasn't alive in that decade. When she did more digging, though, there was no record of this 1911 version of Susanna who had been born sometime in the 1800s. So she goes to the church records to see if they have record of a birth for this Susanna Farrow. They don't. They do, however, have records of a baptism of the baby of Nathaniel and Susanna's daughter from 1912, and her name was June. Our current day June learns from the current day minister that Nathaniel had a daughter and a wife a long time ago before his murder. Outside in the church's little graveyard, June finds the tomb for Susanna Rutherford, who happens to be born on the same day as her mother, Susanna. And then she also finds the grave for June Rutherford, the baby. Now, the baby June was born March 14th, 1912. And then she died October 2nd, 1912. So the baby died when it was about 7 months old on October 2nd. And then June was found on October 2nd in 1989. And she was estimated to be 7 months old. So that was a lot of information. And at this point in the book, I'm like, huh? So understandably also, June is spiraling. I mean, what a weird amount of information to discover. And it all is just way too, like, coincidental, where it's like, this lady's name is Susanna, and they had a baby named June. My mom's name was Susanna. Her baby's name, my name is June. She starts worrying that this is all a part of her delusions. So one night, Birdie is gone. So Birdie and June still live together after Gran died. And June starts she starts doing all this research. She starts spreading her research all throughout the living area, just like articles and pictures and things just spread everywhere, trying to make sense of all of this. And in the middle of her spiral, Mason stops by and discovers what she's doing, and he's like, "What are you doing?" So then June spills everything to him about her last couple of days, and honestly the last year when she's been having all of these delusions back when it started. And understandably, he's very concerned. The next day, Birdie gets home. She sees the research and seems to be unsurprised. And she goes, "Oh, so it started? You've started seeing the red door?" So we find out that Birdie knows a lot more than she ever let on. She is unsurprised about the photo of Nathaniel and Susanna, and she knows that Susanna never really went missing. She tells June that these images, etc., these delusions that she's having aren't actually delusions. She's starting to remember. So basically, she's seeing memories. Now, Birdie, being very unhelpful, only gives her an old envelope and tells her she made a promise that she would give this to June, but she can't tell her anything else, except the next time you see the red door, go through it. So in this envelope is an address. June goes to the address, and when she gets there, it's just this old, abandoned, crumbling farmhouse. She knows she's never been there before, but she can't shake the feeling that it's very familiar to her. Then when she's there, she has this like vision memory of back when the house and land, back when it was like not old and when it was like lived in. So she freaks out and she leaves, but while she's driving away, the red door appears. She gets out to check it out because she's curious. She opens the door and she sees a field on the other side of the door. So she steps through, and then when she does, the door disappears. As you've probably already guessed, the door brought her into a timeline from the past. She starts walking back towards the farmhouse, and it's clearly not 2023 anymore. She ends up coming across this man who she's never seen before, and he definitely knows her, and he's not happy to see her. But she does recognize his voice. It happens to be the same voice that she's been hearing for the past year calling her name. So they have this little confrontation. He realizes this is not the June he knows, and then he starts asking her, what are you doing here? Has anybody seen you? Like, what did you do? And she's like, I have no idea what's going on. I don't know what happened. And then she starts asking about Susanna. She's like, do you know Susanna Farrow or Rutherford, whatever? And he tells her to get in the house, make sure no one sees you, and he'll be back. So he leaves. She does some snooping around the house. And then, of course, in the bedroom, she finds a photo of her and this man in a lover's embrace. Naturally, she loses it. I mean, how would you react in that situation? It's wild. So she runs from the house with no plan in mind. She starts running along the river, and then this mystery lover just finds her, and he's like, you cannot be doing this. And then the sheriff pulls up, and he's like, June, when did you get back from taking care of your sick mother? So clearly people in this time frame know her. We learn this mystery man is Eamon Stone, and he takes June to her old family's farm, and out comes her great-great-grandmother Esther, and this is the grandmother to June's grand Margaret. So Esther raised Margaret, and in this timeline, Margaret is 16. Now comes the time for a bunch more information, and June learns what the women of the Farrow line can do, basically. Now, I had to write out I got to this point and I went back to the beginning and I made a whole list of anytime that names and dates were talked about, because there was a lot going on. I was a little lost. I felt like my brain couldn't quite keep up especially when it comes to like time travel stuff. My brain's like, no. So it took me a little bit to comprehend, but once I wrote it down, it all made sense. The Farrow women can cross into different timelines using this family locket. June got her locket passed down to her when her grand died. So this locket has 4 hands. In whatever position you put the hands, that's the year you want to travel to. And then once you go through the red door with the locket on, you end up in that time. So when June was wearing the locket and she went through the door, it was set to 1951. So that's where she is right now. Obviously, June didn't know any of this, thanks to Gran, who chose to keep her in the dark for her entire life, which according to Esther was a strange thing to do. Why would you not give this person this information where it's like, yeah, by the way, we can time travel? Usually this information is passed down amongst the Farrow women because there are rules to this, as there usually are when it comes to time travel. First, seeing the door can occur at any age, but with every Farrow, it's inevitable that at some point you will cross through it, And then once you do, the fraying begins. So once you pass through, you don't have your one timeline anymore. So that's what can cause this so-called madness or feeling like you're two places at once. Second rule, when you cross into another timeline, you don't continue to exist in the other timeline. 3, classic time travel rule, you don't tell people of the past about the future. 4, you can only cross the red door or timelines 3 times. After that, you'll never see the red door ever again. 5, you don't ever go back to a timeline where there's another version of yourself living. There can't be 2 Junes coexisting in the same time frame. 2023 June has now traveled back to 1951. However, in 2024, that June traveled back to 1946. That's when she met Eamon, fell in love, got married, and then 5 years after showing up in the timeline, 2024 June disappeared a year ago in 1950. Now this would have lined up when a year ago, 2023 June, started having her delusions or like her memories. It was at the same time that this other June disappeared. Everyone is surprised to see 2023 June because no one has ever overlapped like that before, to where a version left and then showed back up again as a younger version of themselves before the older version even got there. June learns that her mother, Susanna, had done a similar thing. She traveled back to 1911, met Nathaniel, fell in love, got married, and then they had June in 1912. June was then crossed over and left in 1989. Since June crossed over when she was 7 months old, that's considered her first crossing. Now June of 2023, crossing to 1951, is her second crossing. So she will only have 1 crossing left. This is where I got confused. Time travel. The 2024 June crossing doesn't count because technically in the normal timeline, that hasn't happened to 2023 June yet. It's wild, it's wonky. It took my brain a long time to comprehend all of this information. I feel like I had to take a couple breaks from this book because I was like, huh? Maybe that's just me. But once I got it, I got it, but it took me a second. Once Esther is done filling her in on all of this information, she tells June that she needs to go back to the farmhouse with Eamon until the red door shows back up again, so then she can get back to 2023. Previously, when June of their time frame disappeared, they told everyone that she was away caring for her mother in another town. Since she's here now, she's just shown back up, she needs to play the part of being the June who was there before. Now, something to note, I do find it very interesting that Margaret decided to never tell June anything, and then June was given a necklace set to the date in 1951. So clearly Margaret is up to something here. She sent June the picture of Nate and Susanna and then set the date to 1951. So at this point in the book, I was thinking it had something to do with Nathaniel's murder. For some reason, Margaret wanted June to end up back in this time frame. And then this would put her 1 year after Nate's murder. So let's move to Eamon. Poor Eamon. June gets back to the farmhouse and there's clearly a lot of hurt on Eamon's part since June left him. They have this awkward conversation and it's clear that he knows everything about her and her time frame and the fact that she's time traveled and everything about the door. He knows everything. He knows that she never wanted to marry and she never wanted to have kids to end the curse. But as it turns out, her and Eamon have a 3-year-old daughter in this timeline, and June had promised him that she would never go back through the door. Well, clearly something caused her to go back through the door. So that is still to be revealed. So there was one thought that I had when I was reading this about why she may have left the 1950s. After her conversation with Eamon, she had this memory of her and her friend Mason skinny dipping, and she knew that this definitely didn't happen back in her timeline, but since it's a vision or a memory, clearly it happened to some version of June. So at this point, I was like, Did she go back through the door to be with Mason instead of Eamon? I have no idea. But I felt so bad for Eamon in this because he was so sad. But the further we got into the book, it became more obvious that this isn't about Mason. It's not about really the romance of, I was like, oh, maybe it's between like, oh, the two guys. No, it's about Nathaniel, the minister who had been murdered. So he was murdered in 1950, and it was a few weeks before 1950 June went back through the door. In the farmhouse, June does some snooping around in the bedroom again, but this time she finds some notes that 1950 June had made, and she listed out the dates 1912, 1946, 1950, and 1951. So she's trying to figure out what was 1950's June doing. So she has this memory of her first meeting Eamon back when she first crossed the door. So she figures if she's able to recall that memory, then she should be able to eventually recall other memories from this time in 1950 and basically try to figure out what 1950's June had going on. And it is really awkward in the beginning that she doesn't remember anything about her life from this time frame, because there's a sheriff in town and he wants to question her about the night that the minister was murdered. So we're able to really piece together now that 1950's June or Eamon or Esther, someone clearly knew something about the murder. And the fact that June disappeared a few weeks after he was killed makes everyone in the town super suspicious of her. So June is taken to the sheriff's office for her statement for the night of the murder. Turns out they don't really want a statement. Her and Eamon are more tied to the murder investigation than June was led to believe. So thankfully, Eamon comes and puts a stop to the questioning, and this is when June learns more from her family about what exactly is going on, which they should have filled her in on all of this before when she first got here, but oh my gosh, poor June. So the sheriff's name is Caleb Rutherford. So turns out Nathaniel and Susanna had a son 2 years after June. So June learns that the sheriff, Caleb, is her brother. And then she also learns that Susanna had Esther take June to 1981 and leave her there to protect her from Nathaniel. Because Nathaniel knew there was something unnatural about Susanna, but he didn't know what it was. And then once she became pregnant, Nathaniel tried to get Esther to poison Susanna so that she would lose the baby. Well, Esther didn't do this, but once Susanna had June, Nate was so convinced that she was a devil child, and then that's why Susanna sent June away and then told Nate that she had died instead. So when 2024 June showed up in 1946, Nate was the minister in this town. He saw her and became obsessed with her because he recognized her because she looked so much like her mother, Susanna. And then she also has this birthmark on her neck. So he was convinced that she was basically haunting him. Nathaniel, the minister, would follow her and sit outside of her house in his car and like crazy stalker shit. Eamon at some point had told him various times publicly to leave his wife alone. So now that makes sense as to why everyone is like looking at Eamon when Nate was murdered, because they all know there was a lot of tension between that dynamic in those relationships. At this point in the book, June has been in 1951 short of 1 week. She keeps having more and more memories of her life from that time frame. It mainly does seem to be like muscle memory though. Of when she like originally lived in that time frame. Like things start becoming familiar, and then we do start getting more flashes or small passages of these past memories. But the more time that she's gaining of the memories from the 1950s, she starts losing bits of her memories from her time in 2023. Now this is concerning because typically when a Farrow goes through the door, it's to a parallel time. However, because of what happened to June, this is a bit of a loophole. She went somewhere where she doesn't exist, but it was a place where she had been before. So things are a bit broken and wonky. Shifting back for a second to Sheriff Brother Caleb, he's determined to solve his father's murder, even though he basically hated his dad and said that his dad was a terrible person and he hated him. He's still like dedicated to solving his murder. He is convinced that June or Eamon had something to do with the murder because there's this wacky neighbor who saw June running that night through her field covered in blood, and also a shoe was discovered in the neighbor's field, and he's convinced that it's June. So it's not a great look. The sheriff breaks into June's house trying to find evidence, and he steals June's notes that she was keeping from earlier, the ones with the 4 dates on it, and then the clippings about the murder and the photo of Nathaniel and Susanna. So he's trying to find evidence. Unlawfully. So June tells Eamon what it was that Caleb took, and then they start brainstorming to see if there's any significance in the 4 dates that June had written down. Now the 4 dates, 1912, 46, 50, and 51, these are the dates that June has crossed over through the door. The date of 1951, though, June would have written this down before she left in 1950. So it's clear that the June from the 1950 time frame was up to something. Now, at this point in the novel, almost all of June's memories have come back from this 1950s time frame, all but the one she needs, which is the one from the night of Nate's murder. She needs to know what happened. She needs to know, because that is the key, it feels like, to why she's back in this time frame, what the past June was doing, but she can't remember. After a short, to the point, very classy, intimate scene between June and Eamon, she finally asks him what she wants to know this entire time. She's like, "Did you kill Nate?" And he's like, "No, June, you did." So the memory of that night all comes flooding back to her. She and Annie, her daughter, were walking back to their farmhouse along the river, and Nate had been following them like his crazy stalker self did. And he was drunk, and he attacked June, and he's like, "I'm gonna baptize you." And then he proceeds to start drowning her in the river while her baby is watching from the bank. And he's like, "This is exactly what I did to your mother." So thankfully, June is able to grab a big rock and just fucking smashes his head, gets the upper hand, keeps on smashing until he's dead. Then she and Annie run back to the farmhouse, tell Eamon what happens. They burn all their clothes, get rid of evidence. And then Eamon goes to the river, drags the body into it, hoping that it'll get swept away. However, the next morning it was discovered by a fisherman, and that's how this whole investigation got started. Eamon's really hoping that people would find him like washed upstream and be like, "Oh, he drowned." But it's very clear that he got murdered. June was not planning on killing Nate, obviously. He's the one who sought her out, tried to kill her, and then she killed him in self-defense. We learn that before this murder happened, June in 1950 was already planning on setting her plan in motion to try to break the curse. So for 1950's June, the door appeared several weeks after the murder. So it was super, super bad timing for her to disappear, super, super sus. But she didn't have a choice because she didn't know when the door would next appear, and she really, really, really wanted to break this curse. This is pretty wild. I'll break it down. In 1950, before June left, she told Margaret her plan. She gave her the picture and the envelope with the address of the farmhouse, and she told her to give it to June in 2022, along with the locket set to 1951. But she made Margaret promise that she would never ever speak this plan to June of the future, because that June would need to decide whether, once she got to the 1950s, if she was going to stay there or if she was going to go back to 2023. So now it makes sense why Margaret never told June about the Farrow curse or spoke to her regarding Susanna or anything regarding any of their family stuff, because she didn't want to mess up the plan somehow. When 1950 June got back to 2022, she went to a time when there was already a June, and one of the rules was you can't go back to a time where you already exist because two Junes can't exist at the same time. So when she did this, their timelines merged into one timeline. So that's why in 2022, right when 1950s June went back to 2022, June started having 1950s June's memories because now their timelines synced back into place. They were no longer two, now they're one. Now, 2020 June kind of messed up her own plan because she had expected herself to tell 1950s June, expected future June to tell Margaret about the door and the delusions, everything, and for Margaret to give her those items in 2022, you know, to almost like speed her up going to 1951 almost immediately after June had originally left. However, since June kept all of the delusions and seeing the door to herself, and then Margaret died, she was never able to carry through. Margaret had mailed June the photo a few days before her death, hoping it would trigger something and that June would go to Birdie and be like, I'm having delusions! Because this whole time, Birdie had also known all about the plan and was entrusted by Margaret to give the farmhouse address to June after Margaret's passing. Now, this is what shocked me. Birdie is Annie, June's daughter from 1950. And Annie has never seen the door or anything like that because June's plan had worked. By creating the one timeline, she broke the curse for Annie. The whole concept is wild. Margaret grew up with June and Annie when she was 16, and then knew everything that would end up happening to her daughter, Susanna, and knew that a version of June would show up as a baby and then she would raise her. And also, since Margaret and Birdie were close their entire lives, essentially Birdie, being June's daughter, ended up seeing her own mother grow up. It's so crazy, but it blends together so well. And when you really think about it, it makes a lot of sense. Now, for the flashbacks that June was having in 1951, remember regarding her and Mason being like more than just friends, that was really confusing to her? Well, that was because without 1950s June interfering with 2023 June, 2023 June would have never gone to 1951. And after Margaret's death, there was about 6 months between Margaret's death and when 2024 June discovered the door. So in the real timeline with no interferences, 2023 June would have started a romantic connection with Mason, but then would have gone back to 1946 in 2024. Now, as we know, June has one last crossing left with the red door, so she has to decide if she's going to now stay in 1951 with Eamon, or if she's going to go back to 2023. So whichever she chooses, since she's now on one timeline, eventually she will completely lose the memories of whichever timeline she decides not to be in. So the question is, do you completely forget your childhood and memories with Margaret as Gran and Birdie and Mason, or do you decide to go back to 2023 and completely forget Eamon and your daughter, Annie, and the life that you were building in the 1950s? When the book got to the ending, June didn't have the luxury of taking her time to choose. The sheriff, Caleb, showed up to arrest her for the murder. And of course, right when he did, the red door pops up for her. Now, Eamon is telling her to go back through the door to save herself, but she makes the decision to go with the sheriff. Now, this ending bit with Caleb got a little off the rails, in my opinion. I felt the same way about how the author had done the ending climax in Spells for Forgetting. The ending just seems so sudden and random. So Caleb was driving away with June, and instead of taking her to the sheriff's office, he takes her to this remote road and starts freaking out and questioning her about who she really is, why she had a photo of his parents and everything. And she's like, I think you know why, implying that they're brother and sister. And then Caleb just gives June the handcuff keys and just leaves her there on the side of the road. And she just gets to be like, oh, I guess. I don't know. I was so confused because Caleb had shown up to arrest June with another officer who was like in a different car. But then when Caleb, so I'm like, when Caleb gets back to the station without June, aren't there going to be questions? This other officer is gonna be like, where'd the suspect go? You're like, I let her go. I don't know. In the end, June ended up staying in 1951 with Eamon. She watched Margaret, her gran, give birth to her own mother, Susanna, watched her own mother grow up. So essentially, there have been these messed up generations of Farroughs that have watched their own mothers grow up. Also, the curse was broken because Bertie/Annie never did end up seeing the red door. So that is the Unmaking of June Farrow. Wild book. I had to read this one slowly and I needed a bit to digest it. It was really unlike books that I usually read, and so I felt like it took me a bit to comprehend what I was actually reading. But now that I've broken everything down and took some time to digest it, I understand it and I love it. If you've read this book, please let me know what you thought of it in the comments below. I love hearing everyone's thoughts. As always, thank you so much for watching and spending your time with me. Don't forget to subscribe and we'll see you next time. Bye.